Margaret had earned her nickname the hard way through 37 years of running the toughest diner in 3 counties. Every rancher, truck driver and traveling salesman knew about Maggie's place on Highway 84, where the coffee was strong, the pie was fresh, and the owner didn't tolerate nonsense from anyone. They called her the widow maker, not because she'd buried 3 husbands, though that was true enough, but because she had a way of cutting men down to size with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a few well-chosen words. At 62, Margaret stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, but she carried herself like a woman who'd wrestled life to the ground more times than she cared to count. Her silver hair was always pulled back in a practical bun, and her apron bore the honorable stains of decades spent feeding hungry souls who wandered through her doors. The morning sun was painting the prairie gold when young Tommy Patterson stumbled into the diner looking like he'd been rode hard and put away wet. He couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that held more worry than any young man should carry. Tommy had been driving all night from Colorado with his last $50 crumpled in his pocket and a sick daughter waiting for him back in Kansas City. He'd heard about Maggie's place from other drivers who warned him about the owner in hushed tones like men discussing a force of nature. "You sure you want to stop there, Tommy?" his friend Jake had said, shaking his head slowly. "That woman Margaret, she'll chew you up and spit you out if you can't pay your bill. She's got no patience for sob stories or hard luck cases," another driver had added. "Best keep driving if your wallet's light." But Tommy's truck was running on fumes and his stomach had been empty for the better part of 2 days. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Margaret looked up from wiping down the counter. Her gray eyes took in his rumpled clothes, his nervous fidgeting, and the way he glanced at the prices on the menu board with barely concealed panic. "Coffee?" she asked without preamble. Tommy nodded and slid onto a red vinyl stool that had seen better decades. Margaret poured the coffee strong and black, just the way prairie men liked it, and set the mug in front of him with hands that had learned gentleness through years of hard living. "When's the last time you ate something more substantial than truck stop candy?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of authority that came from feeding half the county. Tommy looked up, surprised by the directness of the question. "Yesterday morning, ma'am," he admitted, his cheeks reddening with embarrassment. Margaret studied his face for a long moment, seeing something there that others might have missed. She'd raised 2 sons of her own before life took them both in different ways, and she recognized the particular exhaustion that came from carrying burdens too heavy for young shoulders. "You got money for breakfast?" she asked. Tommy's hand went instinctively to his pocket, where the $50 represented everything standing between him and complete destitution. "Some," he said quietly. Margaret nodded and turned toward the kitchen without another word. The morning rush would start soon, and the diner would fill with ranchers and construction workers who'd order their usual plates of eggs and bacon without thinking twice about the cost. But right now it was just her and this young man who looked like he was drowning in circumstances beyond his control. She cracked 4 eggs onto the griddle, added thick slices of bacon, and started a fresh pot of coffee. The familiar rhythm of cooking settled her mind as it always did, reminding her of all the mornings she'd stood in this same spot, feeding people who needed more than just food. When Harold Patterson burst through the door 20 minutes later, his face was red with anger and his voice carried the kind of authority that came from owning half the county. "You're gonna regret this," he warned, pointing a thick finger at his son who was halfway through a plate of eggs and hash browns. "I told you never to come back here, Tommy, and I meant it." Harold Patterson was a man who'd built his wealth through hard work and harder choices. He owned 3 ranches, employed dozens of workers, and his word was law in these parts. When his son had married that girl from the city against his wishes, Harold had drawn a line in the dust that he'd sworn never to cross. "You made your choice when you married her," Harold continued, his voice rising. "Now you live with it without my help." Margaret had been listening from behind the counter, her hands steady as she refilled coffee cups for the handful of early customers. But now she stepped forward, placing herself between father and son with the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of managing difficult situations. "Mr. Patterson," she said, her voice carrying just enough steel to cut through his anger, "your son is eating breakfast in my establishment." "That boy's no son of mine," Harold snapped. "Not anymore." Margaret smiled then, and Harold felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd known Margaret Thompson since they were both young, and he'd seen that particular smile before, usually right before she did something that left grown men questioning their life choices. "Is that so?" she said, leaning slightly closer to Harold with the casual confidence of someone who'd faced down bigger men than him. "Because from where I stand I see a young father who's been driving all night trying to get home to his sick daughter." The diner had gone quiet now, with even the coffee pot seeming to hold its breath. I see a man who's too proud to ask for help even when his child needs medicine he can't afford. Harold's face was turning a deeper shade of red, but Margaret wasn't finished. And I see another man standing in my diner threatening someone I'm currently feeding. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room like dust after a hard wind. Now Harold, you and I have known each other for more years than either of us cares to count. We've buried spouses and raised children and weathered more storms than most people see in a lifetime. Margaret's voice had grown softer now, carrying the kind of warmth that could melt winter frost. So I'm going to ask you to sit down, have some coffee, and remember what it felt like to be young and scared and desperate to do right by the people you love. Harold Patterson had faced down bulls and bankers, rustlers and drought, but something in Margaret's voice made him pause. She moved around the counter with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent decades navigating tight spaces and stopped next to the stool beside Tommy. Sit, she said, gently patting the red vinyl with one weathered hand. Harold found himself sitting before he'd fully decided to do so. Margaret poured him coffee without being asked, adding the single spoonful of sugar he'd been taking for 40 years. Now then, she said, settling her own cup on the counter, Tommy was just telling me about his little girl Sarah. She's got pneumonia, Tommy said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The medicine costs more than I make in a month. Harold stared into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions he wasn't ready to ask. 3 years old, Margaret added conversationally. Same age your Tommy was when he got that fever, remember Harold? Harold did remember nights spent pacing the floor while his wife held their burning sun, nights when he would have traded everything he owned for a guarantee that the child would see morning. You drove to 3 different towns looking for medicine, Margaret continued, wouldn't take no for an answer from anybody. The memory hit Harold like a physical blow. He could still see his young wife's face streaked with tears, could still feel the weight of his small son in his arms. That was different, Harold said, but his voice lacked conviction. Was it? Margaret asked gently, because it seems to me that loving your children and wanting to protect them is about the most natural thing in the world. She refilled both men's coffee cups and settled back against the counter. I buried 3 husbands, Harold, as you well know. Lost both my boys too, one to war and one to a car accident that never should have happened. The diner was still quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that comes when people are listening to something important. And I'll tell you what I learned from all that loss. Margaret's voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. Life's too short to waste on pride and stubbornness. Every day we don't forgive is a day we can't get back. Every bridge we burn is one less way to find our way home. Harold looked at his son, really looked at him for the first time in 3 years. Tommy had grown thinner, his face carrying lines that hadn't been there when he'd last walked out of the family ranch. But his eyes still held the same gentle spirit that had made him Harold's favorite child back when such admissions came easier. She's really sick? Tommy asked quietly. Harold nodded, unable to trust his voice. Medicine costs $800, Tommy continued. Insurance won't cover it all. Hospital wants payment up front. Margaret watched the 2 men sit in silence, each wrestling with years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. She'd seen this particular dance before, fathers and sons who loved each other but couldn't find a way back to saying so. You know, she said finally, I could use some help around here. Kitchen needs painting, fence out back needs mending. Lot of odd jobs that need doing if a man was willing to work for wages. Tommy looked up, hope flickering in his tired eyes. I could do that, Mrs. Thompson. Could do that and more. Margaret nodded slowly, as if considering the idea for the first time, though she'd made up her mind the moment Tommy walked through her door. Course you'd need a place to stay while you're working. Can't very well drive back and forth to Kansas City every day. She glanced at Harold, who was still staring into his coffee cup. Seems to me there's plenty of room at the Patterson Ranch for one more person. Assuming the owner was agreeable to the arrangement. Harold's hands tightened around his coffee mug. 3 years of silence stretched between him and his son, 3 years of missed birthdays and unspoken forgiveness. The old foreman's cabin is empty, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. Could use some fixing up, but it's got running water and electricity. Tommy's eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back for hours. Dad, don't, Harold said quickly, don't say anything yet. Let me drive you home to get your daughter. We'll bring her back here where she can get proper medical care. Margaret smiled, the real smile this time, not the one that made grown men nervous. She'd seen miracles before in her 62 years, but she never got tired of watching them unfold. I'll pack you some food for the road, she said, moving toward the kitchen with renewed purpose. Can't have you driving on empty stomachs. As she wrapped sandwiches and filled a thermos with coffee, Margaret hummed an old song her mother used to sing. The melody drifted over the diner, settling over father and son like a blessing. Harold reached across the space between their stools and placed his weathered hand over Tommy's younger one. "I'm sorry, son," he said, the words coming out rough but sincere. "I let pride get in the way of love. Let fear make me into someone I didn't recognize." Tommy turned his hand over so their palms met. "I'm sorry too, Dad. Sorry I didn't try harder to make you understand." Margaret returned with a paper bag full of food and the thermos. She set them on the counter and looked at both men with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent a lifetime solving problems one meal at a time. "Now then," she said, "you best get going if you want to make Kansas City before dark. Little Sarah's going to want her daddy and her granddad both." Harold stood first, pulling out his wallet with hands that shook slightly. "How much for the breakfast?" he asked. Margaret waved him away with the casual authority of someone who'd just performed a small miracle. "First meals on the house for family reunions," she said. "Besides, I suspect I'll be seeing plenty of you once that granddaughter of yours gets settled." As the two men headed for the door, Margaret called after them, "Tommy, you come back Monday morning ready to work. And Harold, you bring some pictures of that little girl. I want to see what all this fuss has been about." After they left, Margaret stood in the quiet diner watching through the window as Harold's truck pulled away with Tommy in the passenger seat. The morning sun was climbing higher now, and soon the place would fill with its usual crowd of hungry travelers. But for now she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction at a job well done. She'd earned her nickname the Widowmaker through years of tough love and no-nonsense wisdom. But sometimes, Margaret Thompson reflected, the most important battles were won not with harsh words but with gentleness. Sometimes the strongest thing you could do was lean closer instead of pulling away. Sometimes kindness was the most powerful force in the world. She poured herself a fresh cup of coffee and began preparing for the day ahead, knowing that somewhere on Highway 84 a father and son were finding their way back to each other. And in Kansas City a little girl would soon learn that she had more family than she'd ever imagined. Margaret smiled and got back to work. There were always more people to feed, more hearts to heal, more bridges to help rebuild. It was what she did. It was who she was. And at 62 years old she wouldn't have it any other way.